everybody, it's Patrick from Patrick and Friends Music Company, and today we're learning how to play our open dominant 7th chords. Dominant 7th chords are great and useful chords to learn. No matter what genre of music that you play, you're gonna come across dominant 7th chords at some point. Now what I suggest doing is getting down your major and minor chords first, specifically your major chords, because they're gonna come in handy when we learn our dominant 7th chords today. Now if you haven't done that, make sure you check out our videos where we break down major and minor chords step by step. But let's get right to it and let's start talking about our dominant 7th chords. Now what is a dominant 7th chord? To understand this, we're actually going to compare it to our major chord. So a major chord is made up of 3 different notes, while a dominant 7th chord is made up of 4 different notes. And this one note difference is a big difference. You're going to notice that when we play our chord shapes, that there's only typically a 1 note and a 1 finger difference between the major and dominant 7th chord shapes. Now our major chords are made up of the 1, 3, and 5 chord tones, while our dominant 7th chords are made up of the 1, 3, 5, and flat 7. So they share 3 of the same chord tones, but the dominant 7th has that extra note. Now that flat 7, all it is if you look at a major key and you go to the 7th note and you have to lower it by a half step to get to your flat 7. So in the key of C major, the 7th note is B, and if you lower that by a half step, you get B flat, meaning that B flat is going to be in our C dominant 7th chord. Now, if you haven't gone into depth in music theory or you don't really understand chord tones, that's okay. The biggest thing to take away is this 1 note difference. And you're gonna notice when we play our chords, we really need to hear that flat 7. We really need to hear that 1 note difference to make it sound like a dominant 7th chord. We're gonna pick our dominant 7th chords into 2 different categories. The first category is dominant 7th chords that are based off the major chord fingerings. And the second category is dominant 7th chords that have entirely different fingerings. We're gonna start with the first category, and the 3 chords in that one are C7, A7, and E7. Let's start with C7. For our C dominant 7, we're gonna start with the C major chord shape, and then add our pinky to the 3rd fret of the G string. This means that we have our ring finger on the 3rd fret of the A string, our middle finger on the 2nd fret of the D string, our pinky again on the 3rd fret of the G string, and our index finger on the 1st fret of the B string, and then an open high E string. So you're gonna play these 5 strings together. Now to make sure the chord sounds good, hit each string individually. If they all ring out, you're ready to go. Probably the biggest challenge you'll face, as opposed to something you might see on your C major chord, is with that pinky. When you add that pinky, if it's not curved enough, what's gonna happen is it's gonna run into the B string and cause that to mute. And you're gonna get that sound, and then you're not gonna hear your B string note. So you really wanna make sure that pinky is curved, and if you can get that down, your C dominant 7th chord is gonna sound great. For our A dominant 7th chord, let's set up an A major chord. All you're gonna do, no matter what fingering you use for your A major chord, is lift off the finger that's on the 2nd fret of the G string, and you're gonna make that an open G string. So now you have an open A string, the 2nd fret of the D string, an open G string, 2nd fret of the B string, and an open high E string. So play those 5 strings together. Again, to make sure the chord sounds good, hit each string individually. Now with this chord, a lot of times the biggest problem is going to be with that open G string. Whatever finger you have on the D string, if it's too flat, it's going to run into that string and cause it to mute. And this note, that open G string note, is super important. That's our flat 7 note. That's what makes the difference between our A major and our A dominant 7. So we really need to hear that string ring out. So if you're getting this sound, you know you really need to curve your finger. And if you can do that, you can get your A dominant 7th chord down. For our E dominant 7, we're going to set up an E major chord, and we're going to lift up our ring finger on the 2nd fret of the D string. So now we're going to have an open D string instead. Now for this chord, we have an open E string, our middle finger on the 2nd fret of the A string, an open D string, our index finger on the 1st fret of the G string, and then an open B and high E string. To make sure the chord sounds good, hit each string individually. Now if they all ring out, that's great. But similar to the G string on our A dominant 7th chord, the open D string on our E7 chord is really important. That is the note that makes the dominant 7th chord. That's our flat 7 note. So when you set up your E7, if your middle finger is too flat, you're gonna get a muted D string, and the chord's not gonna sound like a dominant 7th chord. It's gonna sound actually more like an E major chord. So you really need to curve that middle finger and make sure that D string can ring out. But if you get that down, you can get down your E7 chord too. Although we used our major chord fingerings to learn our dominant 7th chords, this is actually not the best way to practice them. This is because when we play chord progressions or switch between chords, we want to do so efficiently and quickly. And if you always have to think of your major chord shape, then go to your dominant 7th chord shape, it's going to take a little too long. So we have to think of our dominant 7th chords as in their own category, their own shapes. And the best way to practice this is the same way we practice other chords. What you're going to do is set up a shape. So let's set up C7, and you're going to play that shape. Then you're going to lift your fingers off and put them back down again and play it again. Make sure the chord sounds good before and after. Now what this does is it builds up our muscle memory and gets us used to the shape. If you're a beginner and you have to go one finger at a time, that's totally fine as long as the chord sounds good before and after. And finally, when you get a little more advanced, what you can do is play your chord, take your fingers off, mess them up, wiggle them around, and then put them back down again. And play your C7 chord, make sure it sounds good before and after. For our second category of dominant 7th chords, we're not going to be using our major chord fingerings to get them down. We're going to start with D7 or D dominant 7. So for this chord, we're going to start with an open D string. We're going to put our middle finger on the 2nd fret of the G string. We're going to put our first finger, our index finger, on the 1st fret of the B string, and our ring finger on the 2nd fret of our high E string. We're going to play these 4 strings together. Now to really make sure you got this chord down, hit each string down individually. If they all ring out, you're ready to go. However, again with this chord, probably the biggest problem is going to be with that flat middle finger on the 2nd fret of the G string. If it's too flat, it's going to run into your B string and cause it to mute. And again, that note on our B string is the important dominant 7th chord note, that flat 7. So if you're getting that sound, you're really not going to hear your dominant 7. It's going to, again, sound more like a major chord. So really, really make sure you curve your fingers and get that string to ring out. Sometimes you may encounter that you have to go between D major and D dominant 7, and it can be pretty hard to switch between those two chords. So there's an alternative fingering you can use for D major that can actually help you do that. So if you set up your D dominant 7th chord, and you replace the index finger on the B string with the pinky finger on the 3rd fret of the B string, you now have your D major chord. And now you can switch between these chords easily by switching those fingers. Now, it may be a little unorthodox D major fingering, but this is a great way to get between those two chords. For our G dominant 7, we're going to have our ring finger on the 3rd fret of our low E string, our middle finger on the 2nd fret of our A string, our open D, G, and B strings, and then the first finger, our index finger, on the 1st fret of that high E string. You're going to play all 6 strings together. To make sure the chord sounds great, hit each string individually. Now, if they're all ringing out, you're ready to go. However, with this chord, one of the big issues you might be facing is with that index finger. It's a pretty far reach to get all the way to the 1st fret. And what happens is, once you get that reach down, your other fingers are going to flatten and mute your other strings. So it's a really hard balance of getting your ring and your middle to be curved and your index finger to reach all the way over there and really press that down. Now, honestly, there's no big secret in getting this down. Just the big thing you got to do is practice it. And when your hands start to hurt or start to cramp or start to feel fatigued, just take a break and come back to it. A lot of times, fatigued hands and fingers will make your practice session worse and actually make you a little sloppier. So just take a quick break, come back to it. You're gonna have to work on getting this stretched down over time. Similar to our D major and D dominant 7, there's an alternate fingering you can use to go between G major and G dominant 7, because that can be a pretty tough switch to get between those two chords. If you set up your G dominant 7, what you can do is replace your index finger on the 1st fret of the high E string with your pinky finger on the 3rd fret of the high E string. Now you have your G major chord. Again, a little unorthodox fingering, but it's a lot easier to go between your G7 and your G major chord. So you want to practice these chords the same way we talked about our other chords from before. You want to set up your chord shape, so a D7, lift your fingers off, put them back down again. Again, you can put them back down one finger at a time, and then as you get more advanced, take your fingers off, move them around, put them back down, see how quickly you can get it, as long as it sounds good before and after you lift up your fingers. Dominant 7th chords are a great next chord to learn after you get your major and minor chords down. Now use the same techniques and strategies used on your major chords to get your dominant 7th chords down. whether it be how you curve your fingers, how hard you press down on the frets, or just your overall practice approach. If you use that for your dominant 7th chords, I know you can get these down. Now I hope to see you in the next video, but in the meantime, happy practicing.